as I think, to me, Kath really hit the nail on the head there when we said, our mob have the solutions to some of the long-term problems and long-term issues that we have been discussing for decades. And I think that's one of the key elements of this year's NAIDOC theme, is that it's not only a legislative voice we want a voice in our future. And I think that's not a message that's come 2 years ago from the Uluru Statement of the Heart. It's actually something that generations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been saying for decades, for generations. And only the other week I was reminded by watching the ABC's documentary on the Torres Strait Islands Blue Water Empire, that in 1933 they went on a strike for the pearling industry, which brought the pearling industry to its knees because they were protesting about basic human rights. They were protesting about having a greater say in the policies and programs that affected Torres Strait Islander people. They wanted a greater say in their life. And in most cases, they actually wanted to be treated like human beings. And that was 1933. So for generations, we've been talking about having a greater say, having a voice in the issues that affect us as the oldest continuous culture on the planet. And the Uluru Statement of the Heart 2 years ago, and this year's NAIDOC theme, I think, is a good reminder to the nation. And the NAIDOC committee set the theme because it wasn't a theme that was set to governments, and it wasn't a theme that was set to bureaucrats. It was actually a theme that was set to the Australian nation. And that's why the end of the second line of Voice Treaty Truth is actually let's work together for a shared future. And NAIDOC Week this year is actually more about working together with our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters for that shared future. Importantly, I said before, we meet in Canberra, and for Canberra and the national capital, it's been a place where our people have come for generations to be inspired by leadership and to show leadership. In the 70s with the establishment of the National Aboriginal Congress, the NAC and the NAICC, and of course the Department of Aboriginal Affairs in the 70s. And then we moved on to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission in the 90s. And now we have different bodies through the federal bureaucracy. So Canberra's always been a place that our people have turned for leadership and for leadership to be shown out of. And in welcoming and acknowledging the Minister here and the ACT government, I also want to acknowledge that when ATSIC was abolished in 2004, we lost a national elected structure, and in some ways we lost our ability to have an elected voice. One government stood up and said we are going to have our own Indigenous elected body, and I think in 2004 or 2005 the ACT government established the ACT Indigenous elected body, which is still running today, and I see some of the members here in this room today and I welcome them. And ACT is still the only jurisdiction that has an Indigenous elected body, and I think it's putting pressure on the other states to have that within their structure. Importantly, the ACT also leads in the way of proclaiming a national holiday that celebrates Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and cultures. And of course, 2 years ago, they established a reconciliation holiday here in Canberra. And again, they took the lead, and it brought on discussion here in Canberra about do we need a public holiday, but I think it's also challenged other state governments and even the federal government to actually start looking at doing something that Aboriginal people have been calling for a long time, is that a day where Aboriginal people can celebrate who they are and the nation can join us in those celebrations. So I'm welcoming the Minister here. I also acknowledge the ACT government's move and leadership in that space. All right, our next speaker is the chair of the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute. He's a Wiradjuri man. He's worked in the Commonwealth Government and the Queensland Government for many years. He's also worked with Reconciliation Australia, the National Centre for Indigenous Excellence, and was a board member of the Australian Indigenous Leadership Centre for a long time. It's been almost 8 years since he was named one of Sydney's 100 most influential people. I actually don't know what that means, Jason, but we always knew you influential, brother. So please welcome to say a few remarks the chair of the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute, Jason Glanville.
Thanks. Thanks, JP. Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I travelled in from Melbourne this morning, having spent very little time in Canberra over the last few years, and it's lovely to be here. I want to acknowledge Ngunnawal. Thank you for the welcome. I acknowledge the cultural diversity and wisdom in the room that you all bring into this space, and thank you all for coming into this collaborative space today. I think I just want to reflect very quickly. There's many more important people to hear from than me, but to reflect quickly on the long journey that's gotten us to this place. The Australian Indigenous Governance Institute is a relatively new organisation that's taken really 20 years to create through a range of mechanisms, deeply engaged in trying to understand governance and the role of leadership in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. I acknowledge Janet Hunt, who's in the room, who was with us from the very start of the Indigenous Community Governance Research Project that kicked all of this stuff off. It took us a long time to get to this point, and back when we started, no one was talking about Indigenous governance, or if they were, it was about compliance and corruption and all those myths that we know aren't true of our mob. And people certainly weren't talking about nation building. So it's really exciting, not just to be able to, in the context of NAIDOC this year, to be thinking about themes like truth and treaty and other things, but to be doing that in the context of what I think is the era of nation building in this country, where our mob are asserting ourselves much more strongly connected to the places and the people and the history that we come from, and the connection of that into the collaboration that's building between the Australian Indigenous Leadership Centre and the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute. We're absolutely committed to making sure that we are putting the time and energy, the resources, the research, the support, the direct interventions in partnership with you and your communities to make sure that that nation building effort is well supported, that we amplify the excellence that already exists in the nation building efforts of our communities, and to ensure that you hold us to account to make sure that we're servicing that narrative and those stories in the most powerful way that we can. I served on the board of the Leadership Centre back in the early days of its development for about 10 years, I think. And back in those days, most of our meetings were about winding the joint up for 4 or 5 years as we struggled to find our feet. So I couldn't be more thrilled at just how substantial the Leadership Centre is now, and of course the leadership that you represent, Kath and Robin and the team. It's been an ambition of ours for the Governance Institute and the Leadership Centre to work together for some time now, and I acknowledge the work that Michelle and Robin and the team have done to make that happen. I think what's core to what Kath and JP have been talking about, the longest continuous cultures on the planet, and the connection of that through the themes of this year's NAIDOC work. The two organisations exist because of a fundamental belief over decades now that the enforced deficit narrative that the mainstream still represents in terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we know that that's not our default position, that's not who we are and what we come from. The innovation, the governance, the creativity, the commitment to culture and to community and to family that comes with being the oldest continuous cultures on the planet means that we've done it better and continue to do it better than most. And both of our organisations are absolutely dedicated to ensuring that we amplify that and not just change the narrative or talk about changing the narrative from deficit to one of Indigenous excellence, but to acknowledge that Indigenous excellence is what we are and who we've been for 75,000 years. So I'm thrilled that this collaboration's happening. It's great to kick off the partnership in such a powerful way in Canberra and to get ahead of the NAIDOC rush and to kick off the program. So happy NAIDOC, happy early NAIDOC, and thanks again for coming.